I have said that spring arrived late in 1916, and that up in the trenches opposite Memoirs, it seemed as though winter would last forever. I also stated that as for me, I had more or less made up my mind to die, because in the circumstances, there didn't seem anything else to be done. Welcome to the Doomed to Repeat It podcast. This is Chuck, and this is podcast 004, our continuing series on World War I. And this book, Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, is from Siegfried Sassoon. And Siegfried Sassoon was a young lieutenant in Her Majesty's Infantry in the trenches. At his heart, he was a poet and a creative, and grew up on a farm. Some said that he had a kindred spirit with horses. But gallantry oozed out of his soul while he was in the trenches. And that first line says it all. Both a tragic story and a triumphant story. So the gentleman who wrote the foreword is Paul Fussell, Fussell, and his introduction to Sassoon was is pretty much a historical tribute, right? Because he was also a warrior, and he served in France in World War II, and as an officer in Her Majesty's Army. He saw his best friend killed, and then he came home and became an academic and wrote 20 pieces of works. World War I is special to us who love literature and history and historical fiction and the deep meaning of tragedy, horror, triumph, because World War I, in those trenches, was born The Lord of the Rings, was born the works of Hemingway, was born F. Scott Fitzgerald, and countless other writers and artists and creatives of that time. They witnessed and were part of a, horrible type of warfare. All warfare is horrible and evil, and no one wants to think about the evil part of it, but that's exactly what it is. There are evil people doing bad deeds to good people all over the planet as we speak, and there are people, good people, who are doing bad things to bad people all over the planet. It's part of the human condition, right? So Siegfried Sassoon, he was a romantic at heart, and he loved to read, he loved to create. He was a farm boy. He was, in great physical condition because he worked on the farm. He loved to be outdoors, and he was a man who just loved nature, and experiencing the horrors that he saw kind of changed his outlook on life a little bit, as it would and as it does everybody. I heard General Mattis once say, and it rings true, war makes good men better and bad men worse. There's a lot of lessons to be learned in the story, and it's going to be broken up into parts. So the parts of the story, it's pretty cool. It's just an awesome read. I highly recommend that if you are a lover of life and a lover of lessons in life, that you pick up this book. I've had it on my shelves for pretty much a decade, and I picked it up last year to read, and I skimmed over right before we did this podcast. But Memoirs of an Infantry Officer is a first-person account of the horrors of World War I in the trenches, and he had already seen some heavy combat and come to the conclusion that, hey, if I die, I die. That's my going in. So he's at this school, and it's just mundane, tactics, techniques, and procedure. What it really was meant for was battlefield commanders would recognize the stresses of combat or earned rest by those who did that little extra, and he was one of those officers who given a respite from the front to get cleaned up, to think about things. Kind of like Eddie Rickenbacker, when he got sick, he at his 6-month mark, talked about that in the last podcast. He was able to reflect and figure out through wisdom that, hey, this is how I'm going to survive, and this is how I'm going to be a better fighter pilot and a better ace when I come back. Where most of them at the 6-month mark, their chances of being shot down or dying increased exponentially, as did the officers here on the front. Colonel Kinjak liked him because he was heroic and he was a true creative. So he talks about, perhaps Colonel Kinjak had heard I'd been looking for trouble, so he sent me off for a rest to go to this school. So it's in theater. It's kind of like, again, a school in the rear with the gear. Just give them a rest in the front. They went over Monday's subjects that probably did not have time to do when they were deployed. So it was kind of a finishing school. They could take some of these techniques, tactics, and procedures back into the trenches. And he's back in the, so now he's no longer in his room from school. He's back in the trenches. And he was supposed to lead a raid, a pretty important raid of 25 soldiers on a Thursday. So on a Monday and Tuesday, the colonel was looking to him to have this raid. He's like, yeah, I'm probably going to, get this raid. But there was another officer who spent a lot of time with the colonel trying to get the raid from him. But he kept it. He was always going to be the man to lead the raid. But he was illustrating that even though there was another officer trying to take this honor away from him, right, that he was just like, I'm just going to go to bed. I'm not going to spend time with the colonel at all. I'm not even getting involved in it. I'm going to play it cool. And because he's a very, very astute student of nature, and not just nature, but the nature of people. And he's very observant. He can call someone, he figures people out in short order. And he's articulating this in his book too. So he never is canceled off the raid, but he doesn't play the politics because he's already got a lot of capital in the respect column, okay, from not just his subordinates, but from his superiors as well. And he's humble about it. He writes about it, but it's not, I mean, you've got to really feel the words when they come out. He's not a braggart in any sense of the word, but he is conveying, what happened and how he felt. Now he's back on us. He gets a 7-day leave, another 7-day leave, and he's on his last night on the 7-day leave. He bought 2 salmon for his colonel for forgiveness for being UA, and 2 bottles of brandy bottled in 1836. One for the colonel, and then one for the 2 soldiers that served with him doing this raid. There was only 3 that survived out of 25 that he led. He talks about the men in a wise way in the whole book. He was with them, and he figured them out pretty quick. And in that environment, a combat environment, you can really feel a person, especially if you've been working up with them for 6 months, and then you get into combat. But even the people you meet on the battlefield, or you go into the COC and you work with different units, you can figure out people pretty quickly. And he talks about this in the book a lot. So he also had a lot of contempt for the general staff. But that goes for even today's forces. We all have kind of contempt for higher headquarters. We know what we're doing. The captains and the lieutenants and the sergeants and the corporals and the lance corporals are kicking in doors, doing the deed, dropping bombs, firing artillery, actually conducting the operations, doing the patrols, building the defenses for the captains. The captains, tell the colonels what they want to hear, and the colonels tell the generals kind of what they want to hear. But there's always this, at every layer, there's this air of contempt for the general staff, and all the staff officers look down and they don't know what's going on, and it back and forth, and the guys in the ground are just like, definitely they don't know what's going on. Ultimately, nothing's changed. It's always going to be that way in the military. It's a healthy contempt to keep each other in check. He doesn't like his captain. He doesn't like his captain, Barton. He doesn't really say anything about him bad, except that he doesn't like him. But he always is stroking his ego. He's always trying. He understands that to get through this thing, that leader who's been put in charge, who's not an evil person, and he hasn't done anything, you know, that's against the men. Maybe he's a weak leader, but he's always trying to help him out. He's always stroking his ego to make sure that they can get through this, because, I mean, as that company commander, if he goes the opposite direction, it will make the whole company miserable. On the night before the raid that he's supposed to lead, that he leads, he notices that the captain is uneasy and withdrawn, because this raid that he's supposed to go on, that he's ordered to take these troops out, they are supposed to go out before they go over, the main force goes over the top, and supposed to cut the barbed wire. Well, he's on leave before. He talks about buying some wire cutters. So he knows that the wire cutters at the Army are crap, and he has an opportunity to buy some wire cutters. So he took the initiative, you know, before they even got there, to buy these high-speed wire cutters. So he takes this troop through, and we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. But the captain is more uneasy than he usually is, and it's probably because this is the big push. This is the big push in 1916 that was, hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides, but it was the first large force that the British had fielded in a very, very long time. They got there in 1915. This is now 1916, and big picture, looking down, that's what they're looking at. Blood red light, smoke, and rain clouds. He talks about the weather and the feel of, and you can feel through his words how they were, where they're cold, with the trees, the snow, the smell of the rain. He had it all down. So Barton wants him to go in and cut the wires. They go over the top at night before the big attack, under fire. So they're under fire and they're returning fire, and he's in charge of this whole thing. It says he was meditating, trying to get his mind out of the trenches where the Lord of the Rings was born, because it was, completely out of control. But he's a humble professional. The humble professional had the foresight to purchase wire cutters because he knew that they would need them. He even writes humbly as if it was a mistake. He was given the task of cutting down the wire under fire at night with 8 other soldiers. 2 were wounded, and after 3.5 hours before dawn, only he and 2 other tough soldiers were fighting on. So ultimately, 8 of them went out and 3 came back. So very heroic, goes out, brings that little mission to conclusion, but they had cleared the way, and he ends up getting a medal for it, the 3rd highest medal that the British bestows, and it's they call it the Military Cross, right? And it is like getting a Silver Star. It's 3rd highest medal for bravery, right? So he writes about getting the award, and this resonates with every soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, Coast Guardsman who's fighting today, who fought in Vietnam, who fought in Korea, who fought in World War II. They understand this. So he writes, I quote, "The safest thing to be said is that nobody knew how much a decoration was worth except the man who received it." That's pretty powerful. When a warrior receives a medal for bravery, most are extremely humble. Most don't think they deserve it. But there are a lot of heroic people that don't get recognized, and they understand that too. And then you've got your group that gets recognized for heroics that were much less than someone would give them credit for. I cannot turn my field glasses into the past, he wrote after describing his penciled particulars. My military cross was a comfort to me. It was a definite personal possession to be lived up to, I thought. So, deep inside, I mean, he understands the human nature and the human condition, and he's been in the trenches and almost foolhardy in his bravery. But he accepted the medal. He thought he deserved the medal, but he also thought he had to live up to the medal. And you hear a lot of Medal of Honor winners, all heroes. I mean, completely humbled, and deservingly so. Some it ruins. Some become raging alcoholics, and that's all they do. And that medal defines them. I think it's different to live up to the standards, and have to continue to live your life up to those standards is one thing, but to have the medal define you is another. I mean, for instance, Dakota Meyer is a great American Marine Sergeant. We all know he's a Medal of Honor winner. On his podcast, and I was surprised when I heard it. He's just like, I don't even know where my medal is. That medal, he hates the medal. He talks about it openly that he hates the medal. He's like, I don't want that medal to define me. It's like a reminder of my worst day of my life. So, everybody's is different, and you just got to honor their perspective on the medal. And in his case, he thought he was deserving, but now he's got to live up to its standard, which is pretty humbling and pretty cool. So now they've gone over to the top. It's one of the worst battles the British will fight throughout the war. In 1916, hundreds of thousands killed, and what they do is they send units to the front and to the back, and to the front and to the back, for semi-fresh to worn out, torn up, coming back. There's a scene in the series The Pacific when then Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller's battalion commander, and they're on the fighting a bloody battle on the island of Peleliu, and he, as the battalion commander, and a company up front have spent their time on the line, and they come back and they're raggedy, and their eyes are sunken in. Some are on stretchers, some are dead. Their fatigues are torn, and then the units going out to replace them, they're semi-refreshed. They have new fatigues. They're taking the cigarettes and the ammunition from those ragged souls that are coming back from the line. He talks about that here when he's in reserve. And I quote, he felt a fraud because they had been at the front up until now. Now they were in the reserves and feeling guilty. Part 5, the escape. So he's going to get a respite, complete respite, because he's got flu-like symptoms. He writes he's got flu-like symptoms. He's extremely sick, probably extreme battle fatigue, because he's actually survived this whole ordeal where, depending on the source, it's like 80% of British officers died in this battle. I mean, it's a very high number. Whether his colonel wanted to preserve him, or it was a combination of wanting to preserve him because of his heroics and potentially become a future career officer, or he had battlefield fatigue, PTS. He talks about the twitching, the shell shock, and whatnot. They call it PTS back then. It was a shell shock. And he talks about drinking, and he just mentions that it may have been alcohol poisoning combined with all the other stressors. Bottom line was he was sent back home. So newspaper men always kept the horrifying realities out of the war in their articles, for it was unpatriotic to be bitter, but no longer. That wasn't happening in this war. This is a completely different war. Somehow his flu-like symptoms may have actually been an all-night bender that gave him alcohol poisoning. But his journey back to England, due to a doctor seeing his receipt of military cross, got him a ticket home. In other words, he goes back to the field hospital, and the field hospital sees that, and he go to the next level of care. And then once he gets back to England for a short respite, he's like, yeah, he's going to get some long-term care. Part 6, at the depot. So he's been back in England recuperating from a combination of shell shock, PTS, of probably alcohol poisoning, and just the constant, misery, and the constant misery of the trenches and continuous combat. So he's back in England back at the regiment with some officers in his same boat that, have the same kind of conditions. He's already been to a couple boards, but then he goes to another board, and this board says, hey, no, you've got to stay here another 4 or 5 months. You're not going back to the front at all, period. End of story. And there's a pretty funny part, as the New Year's happens, as now it's 1918, and they're continuing fighting over there, and he's riding back and forth to his fellows, and they're like, no, dude, you need to stay in England till after the winter. It sucks here. Don't worry about it. We got you. And for, a warrior to have that kind of respect for a lieutenant that has probably already done way more than he was expected to do. I mean, that's some pretty good props, man. His buddies and telling him, hey, don't, stay there. But that was going to happen anyway. He doesn't go into depth on what happened to him, but it's probably, PTS, and he wanted to, he didn't, when he wrote about it, he didn't seem guilty about it at all. He did what he was supposed to do, and that was pretty much it. Part 7. Ruin in February. So February 1918, R-O-U-E-N in February. He's put in this unit, and he really doesn't know anybody, and he seems comfortable in the anonymity that no one really knows who he is. Although they wear his medal, so they know he's been in combat. He's been out of the fight for about 6 months, which is pretty cool. But during this time, he reflects on the war profiteers back in England, and kind of goes the way of a protester, and is not in line with, as we call in Marine Corps, God, Country, and Corps. He starts to have these thoughts. He talks about temporary gentlemen enjoying their decent dinner and these types of things. So it rolls into Part 8, his 2nd Battalion that he's in. Easter weekend, 1918. By Monday, the battle begins. 2nd Battalion, his battalion, is in reserve and starting to march up. His company commander and he reconcile, and after copious drinking, remember he didn't like Barton before, so he's back. They drank a lot. They talked about cricket music, and then they started to advance that next day. Here he thinks of suicide and how some take their lives. He thinks, no, he knows he has to come to Jesus. But by now, he's forgotten religion, where he was religious before. He talks about it all here. And just the thinking of suicide with the veteran epidemic, veteran suicide epidemic that we are currently in, it is a thought that touched every generation of warrior and continues just by him merely writing about it back then. But it further fuels his, these ill feelings about the war and why they're there. So the company of 80 strong and 600 yards to cover now they're at the Hindenburg Trench. So he's putting the group of his unit is going forward, and they're right over here at the trenches, and there's another unit that he comes in contact with, and there's two other officers and he. And back in those days, they'd wear their combat decorations as a ribbon on their uniform. So there were two others with the military cross. They were decorated in combat already, and he. So they got together, but he wanted this. He wanted to take these 25 men and go through the trenches and lead this patrol. So he started to chat them up and talk about strategy and tactics and whatnot. But he wasn't that type of officer. He didn't pay attention to those things. He knew how to hook and jab and inspire, but he didn't understand the tactics, and admittedly so. But he found himself in a position that he was a leader of this group, and with the colonel in front, he's like, okay, I'm doing this. I'm taking this mission. He gulps down two of the pieces of cake in the colonel's hooch, if you will, puts his helmet on, and goes out and leads this attack. It's 25 men, and he talks about throwing some bombs and shooting, but then he gets shot in the chest, and it exits, goes right through him, through his chest, and out his back. And he talks about he thought he got hit in the back. He felt the blowback from the round exiting his body that actually pushed him forward, is what he felt. So basically, he's out of it. He's out of it. He's wounded. He wakes up at the aid station, and he will not, once he leaves the battlefield this time, he's not going to return. But he's already got these thoughts in his head about stopping the war, how the war was, Great Britain shouldn't have got in, and it goes right into part 9. Hospital and convalescence. After his second deployment, he writes, I began to feel that it was my privilege to be bitter about my war experience. And my attitude towards civilians implied that they couldn't understand, and that it was no earthly use trying to explain things to them. Now, that's extremely, extremely common in every war. Every war that comes down the pike, even when I come back, I talk to people differently. And your experience is your own, and that's part of the misunderstanding and divide. So he actually talks about when he comes back from combat, 2 tours, wounded twice. He's put in for another medal, by the way, for the unit that he was with who got shot. He talks about how he interacts with senior officers. His senior officers, he was like, yes, sir, I'm thinking very seriously about, staying in the Army and being that guy. God, country, and corps, and that whole thing, Queen and all that. For middle-aged and elderly civilians, he speaks to them about King and Country, of course, and how he had been there, and the expressions, because he had to, but he had an inability to describe the horrors of war to these middle-aged and older civilians. And he wishes he had been wounded more. In other words, missing a limb or something. There's a little bit of guilt there when he spoke to these folks. And he talks about when he speaks to his sister of a brother officer. So someone who's connected with, has a family member in the military, and he talks to, he's like, yeah, with those people, I'm jocular. I'm talkative, debonair, actually. He uses that word. But he doesn't talk about no horrible acts, and he just talks about the struggles of war, but nothing horrible. So he's filtering each one of these subgroups of people. They filter, and we find I do that to this day. I don't tell my mom certain things about combat. The people that I went to combat with on the ground in Fallujah and Ramadi, I know those people, and I mean then. It's a completely different discussion. Other warriors who may or may not have been with me, that's a different discussion. Family members, that's a different discussion. Trusted people in business and people you're dealing with, kind of, filter in a different way. You don't want to talk about the horrors of war, but You do want to talk about the leadership lessons that you learn and the things that, you know, that accelerate your life that you learned on the battlefield, you know, whether it's on the ground or in the air at sea. His hunting friends, his non-military friends, he kind of plays down the suffering, and he's kind of jovial about, yes, like throwing a bunch of hand grenades trying to kill foxes and whatnot. Again, it seems like the ultimate human. He's just trying to connect with everybody, and, you know, without offending people. So many veterans come back and they just don't have that filter. They don't have either they don't have a filter, or their filter is not effective, or it's they're still developing their filter, right? Because there's really a high probability that, you know, you're going to offend somebody if you just tell it like it is, and you have contempt for that person who doesn't understand, but they want to understand. But the part of it that we try to convey gets lost in translation sometimes, because everyone hears what they kind of want to hear because of their biases, and when it comes out of their mouth, you know, veterans think, well, they're kind of disrespecting me because that's not the way, because they can't articulate what you experienced. So in that case, that's when it becomes the strife between civilians and veterans. And it's not all of them, but it is an issue, and I've seen it. I've seen it at every level. So it's something that we all can get better at. Writes, war and its brutal stupidity, those men had stood glorified by the thing which sought to destroy them. So he ends up at this manor, and it's called, you know, he calls it the Lady and Lord Asterisk is the people who run it, and it's Nutwood Manor is what he calls it. Those afflicted with PTS. Back then it was shell shock. His bosses still think that he should be a career officer, but he's not having it. And the day he decides not to be that career officer is the day that he realizes that he is that creative. He is the creative, he is the poet, he is that artist. And he comes out and he's gay, he's homosexual. And he has brought he has brought all this wisdom from the trenches and his combat experience, and it is poured into his literary work. So check out what he's got. He's got written. Just a phenomenal author and poet. So part 10 is called Independent Action, and this kind of bookends the rest of the book. Part 10, Independent Action. All right, so here we are, part 10, Independent Action. So he initiated a meeting with the editor of an ultra-conservative weekly to write an anti-war article. He was going to have to embrace the self-serving non-veterans that he so loathed. So he has an epiphany. He's decided to write this anti-war article going against, he's a heroic field officer in the British Army, and he's well respected. And his bosses, and even their Department of DOD, they call it Whitehall, they're like trying to talk him out of this whole thing. He could just be court-martialed. They'll just court-martial him. But he's been in and out of hospitals because of his PTS, and he talks about it in a way that it's just, yeah, okay, I've got shell shock, but I mean, enough's enough. You can't keep me here forever, ever. So ultimately, he gets to go to these medical boards, and a person who respects him in the Army has some influence on the medical board, and he gets through the medical board with flying colors, as he should. He's, this anti-war rhetoric. Some of the Army officials, it seems like they're trying to cover it up and call it shell shock, but the others, there's another camp that wants to hang him because he is wearing the uniform and he is bad-mouthing the Queen and country and the King and country and all that. So his capital, he's got a lot of respect capital amongst people that know him, and that are in positions that can make decisions. So he goes to the medical board and he passes the medical board, and he's ultimately asked to be a cadet instructor. So like a ROTC instructor, an OCS instructor for new officers that are coming into the Army, which is a pretty big deal, right? They know he's articulate, they know he's heroic, they know that he's intelligent, and everybody that worked with him loved him, absolutely loved the guy. So he goes to the church at Cambridge. You know, he's offered this position in the Army, and he goes to the church. He said, and he's not religious. He says he's not religious, but he comes out of the church. He tears up some train tickets that were given to him to go report to the cadet, class in the Army, and he decides to resign. He decides to resign and follow his passion, his authentic swing as a poet, as an author, and he becomes extremely prolific. He lives to be the ripe old age of 80, and at 47 he marries. He has his one son, George. He is homosexual, admitted it, and has lived a great life. But his life was catapulted, one, by his decision to go with his heart and go with his authentic swing. And that guy was just phenomenal writer. There's so many more nuggets of wisdom in this book that I don't want to cover right now, but I think his story is noteworthy. And for all of us that are struggling with finding your authentic swing that Stephen Pressfield talks about, go with your gut. He went with it early. He would have been an awesome career Army officer. He would have got along. He already had all those skills if that's what he wanted to pursue. And he said no. He prayed on it and he said no. He knew he was going back into combat. He had been wounded twice. He had done 2 tours and been extremely heroic on both cases. His disdain for officers and his medal, his other medal didn't get passed through because of his wanting to write the anti-war article. Does not take away from the fact that he was heroic and he deserved the medal. Because he was going on this road, they took the medal away from him. His disdain for officers and his medal were complete. He is going on his own way in his real life. A homosexual, a poet, a writer, an artist, a creative. Not as a professional officer, but a brave artist who went to war and was robbed of martyrdom. His words. End of sermon. So there you have it. Lessons, many. Authentic swing. You know it when you feel it, when you're doing something you're passionate and you look up and you don't know what time it is, or you stay up all night doing something that you're passionate about. The things that you think about when you're doing your real work, that's a pretty good sign that maybe that you should be leading down that direction. If you're passionate about it and you're very good at it, and if you're not so good at it and you're passionate about it, you will get good at it. So, there you have it. Lessons from World War I, a British officer's memoirs. Memoirs of an infantry officer, Siegfried Sassoon. This is one British officer's perspective on the war and how it was in the trenches, his lead up, and his decision to say, hey, I know I'm going to die. It's just going to be a reality. And to go through the combat that he went through and to take these lessons back. So read about him. He's very well known in literary circles, and looking forward to hearing about y'all's comments. Always try to find that path in life that's going to make you most happy, but more importantly, that is your authentic swing. Thank you all for listening. This is Chuck Bagnato, Doomed to Repeat It podcast, number 004. Good night.